Hey guys, Nikki here. Today we have something a little different. With the new year, I wanted to try doing a project that's been stuck in my head for a while now, which is an anime figure repaint. As you can probably see, I'm a huge fan of manga and anime. I've done a few projects that are inspired by it, but I wanted to kind of go that next step to take a figure and make it look like it's straight out of the anime. I found and I follow a few people on Instagram and Twitter that do similar repaints, and their work has been so inspiring. It looks like so much fun. I wanted to dive in myself. So I figured where better to start than Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball is my comfort anime. I grew up watching it with my brother. I've kind of come back to it now as an adult, which is dangerous because I now have adult money to do things like this. So decided to start with that series. For my first project, I went ahead and I picked up this Vegeta figure. So I figured keep it pretty simple for a first project. I'd like the pose for this. We don't have to worry about a lot of the special effects and things like that. One of my favorite characters, Vegeta's great. So wanted to see how kind of painting from Warhammer translates over to the anime style, and I thought he would be a good candidate for that. With this, I'll also be doing more of a vlog style video, which is new for me. I'm going to be working on him kind of off and on between commissions and other projects, but I wanted to bring you guys along with me as I learn, kind of see the differences as we paint something like this. So make sure to like and subscribe for updates as we go and to see the finished project. But for now, let's take a look at the figure itself. We're at the hobby desk now, opening up the figure. This is the Banpresto Solid Edgeworks Vegeta. If anyone is new to anime figures, they usually have a couple pieces that do need to be assembled, and then will also come with a plastic bit that helps with display that their feet will either slot into or it'll rest against. As we open the kit, we see that Vegeta is in two pieces, separated at the torso, and then that stand that I mentioned is there on the left in the cardboard protector. He looks great though. The solid edgework seems to be some nicer details that we'll use while we're repainting. I'm still fairly new to anime figures as a whole, so I can't give a full detailed review of them, but from the bat, it looks like a good start for us. The paint's decent too out of the box, but of course we're wanting to go even further beyond. This looks like a good base to start with. For some of these repaints, I've seen some of the painters actually use what comes with the figure as their base coat, and then they add shading and highlighting directly over it. I've decided to go ahead and prime over just to give us a restart. I feel like it'll be easier for touch-ups as we get used to this type of painting, so I will be doing that. I do kind of note where the figure is starting out though for color matching purposes. Speaking of color matching, decided to go ahead and grab a few colors I thought we could choose, see how they stack up against what's already on the model. I grabbed McCraig Blue from Citadel, along with Dark Blue and a Faded Ultramarine from Monument Hobbies. I grabbed these because I thought, from what I remember, they were close. I also grabbed Calgar Blue to kind of get a look at, and I know it works well with the McCraig. So for our blues, I can pull those out to kind of look at initially. For the boots and the gloves, I immediately go to Celestra and Ulthuan from Games Workshop. I've used these before for whites, and they work really well. For the yellow, I pull out Gold Brown from Vallejo and Uriel Yellow. I have used these before for yellow. They seem like a perfect fit. For skin tones, I actually picked up a few new ones from Vallejo. We have basic skin tone here, which I will be using as kind of the highlight tone. I also grabbed this flat flesh, which I am planning to use as a shade. So just kind of seeing that against the figure to see where that kind of lies and where we are starting. So those are the paints I pulled out initially, but I figured I needed a few more references. So I put this together. Here is my very cheesy vision board with the references that I pulled and found and wanted to use. It's also where I realized this project was going to be a lot tougher than I initially thought. This outfit's in the Boo Saga, and it's basically all one color. Man's suit is navy, and more navy. I pulled screenshots from the anime, it's just very flat. I hopped a bit ahead, and while he's not in Super Saiyan for the figure, I prefer the contrast here in his Majin Vegeta form. I think it brings it to life a little bit more. I went ahead and saved these, decided to check the manga also for any other ideas, even going back to some of his earlier fits to see if they had anything that I could kind of keep and use as reference. It's basically the same, again with more contrast in the Super Saiyan aura. I hopped ahead to Super, and then some more recent Vegeta, and I may have gotten distracted. Ultimately, decided to go ahead and use the Majin Vegeta examples for the contrast and bring in the brighter colors. We'll keep the lighting to the left side. I noticed the box art also has photographs for him for both sides, so I'll be using that as a reference as well. For their game plan, with vision board complete, we dive into prep. For prep, he does have some mold lines that basically run down the middle of the figure, so you can see here I point to a few that run along the legs and the arms as I go. There's also some writing for the figure on the back of the legs that I scrape off. I'm just using my X-Acto knife and then these filing sticks to try and smooth them out the best that I can. I'll include links to these in my bio if you'd like to use them, along with any other paints and things, so be sure to check that out if you like what I am using here today. So I am working my way around the figure just for some basic prep and to get these mold lines, seam lines all taken care of before we do our priming. As I continue working my way around the figure, I definitely noticed that having all of this say in here is also kind of a pain to get in here and clean up, so I will definitely keep that in mind for next time to clean up around his face and his hair here. I give him one more fit check and check him over one more time, and it's ready for priming. And here he is after priming. I use this surface primer from Vallejo in gray through my airbrush to keep the colors as close as natural as we can, plus we want the brighter colors for the cel shaded effect that we're going for. I do this so that we have a clean slate for touch-ups, but painting over the figure base coat is another option as we were talking about earlier, so I decide to prime. After letting the primer sit for pet and cure, I decided to start with our blue. This is a little bit of my Warhammer painting background coming in, as the blue will be easier to touch up than skin tones, but as I learned, it doesn't really affect it the same way. It's what I know from previous projects, so I go with it. It also explains a little bit of my next step. For Warhammer models, I would normally mask off for airbrushing. I like to use Silly Putty to do this. It's cheap, wraps around the model easily, and it's also reusable. So here you can see me wrapping the figure so that I can do the skin tone and boots. Again, for this project, I don't find it's necessary as I go, but I wanted to include it as I'm working through it for the first time. Going forward, I'd probably either airbrush the skin tones and then do the blue by hand, but now I know. If you're not used to using Silly Putty, you can see how easy this is to use. I usually let the paint dry a bit and then you just peel the putty back off. It won't stick to your model, but does stick to itself, so it can be great to get the last little bits off, but also a pain as you're arranging it on the model. Just a heads up, if you're layering different pieces near each other, it will stick to itself. Here we're putting the last little bits of Silly Putty on so that he is all ready for airbrushing, and then I go to do his skin tones. Okay, back now, and I've done the airbrushing for the skin tones. This is all here, and this is with our basic skin tone, again from Vallejo. And I start to peel the Silly Putty off, so you can see here how the Silly Putty helps to protect the blue that we've already done, and doesn't stick to the model, so it just masks the area that we don't want paint on, while protecting all of the blue, letting us do the skin tone. Probably won't use this again, but that would be, if you wanted to use the Silly Putty, that is how you would use that here. So peeling all of this off. With the Silly Putty removed, I go ahead and I go in by brush for touch-ups. There are portions where I use too much of the Silly Putty and now the skin tones need a touch-up, so I tackle these before we move on to the rest of the hand brush detail portions. This is the point where it starts to feel weird not thinning my paints as much as Warhammer. We want full coverage to cover up the airbrush and to cover the figure. Thicker layers work for the cel shading. We just want to try and keep them as smooth as possible as we go. I work around the figure for my touch-ups. Some of this will need a second coat, but yeah, definitely starting to feel weird not thinning my paints quite as much as I would for Warhammer. Here I actually did have a little bit of Silly Putty left over, so we remove that and go ahead and continue our touch-ups for this other arm, trying to get this all ready for our next steps. With our Basecoats down, it's time to start our first shadows. I decided to use dark blue from Monument as the shade for our blue and kind of hit all of the easy spots first as we start to figure out the cel shading. My initial pass are the very obvious spots that are sculpted into the model, along the underside of his pecs, the folds of his outfit along his chest, around the abs, all of these really obvious, already sculpted places on the sculpt. We're just adding shade to accentuate, exaggerate, add depth. I'll also be adding a shade along his waist, where it would be shaded by his arm, and follow the shape of his torso. Then I move on to his legs, basically doing the same thing for these easy spots. Doing the muscles here as sculpted, and then creating a shadow closer to his groin as he's striding forward here. Doing the same on the other leg, just following the shapes and the muscles, the curvatures already that are part of the sculpt, just as a first pass to see how this will look. I go back for his back now that the front is dry, so I don't accidentally stick my fingers in wet paint. Again, going for folds in the fabric, any obvious bits before I really dive into more of the cell shaded style the next time. It's pretty basic at this point, but for our first pass and the end of my first paint session on him, I'm pretty content, so I go ahead and I wrap up for the day. Alright, and we're back for session 2, I believe a weekish later. Decided to start with some easy stuff, so his black hair is up first. I used my favorite black paint. This is Vallejo Model Color Black for this. It dries super matte, and I just love it. So I go on my palette, and I just go to town. I try to get around all the different peaks, but you'll see here I'll have to do several touch-ups as I find more spots hiding in all of this hair. So continuing to work through all this hair. With black on the palette, I also started his eyes and eyebrows. We want to keep his expression as close as possible, so I'm very careful with this step. I'm also trying to limit the amount of touch-ups with this very light skin tone, so I'm taking my time here. For the eyes, I do black first, then the white later. A little sad we don't get to do the heavy guy liner he gets as Majin Vegeta. We'll save that for another time. With the black drying, decide to try our shadow skin tone. This is Vallejo Game Color Flat Flesh. I put some on my palette. I'm going to go straight against the perfect widow's peak to start shading the right side of the face. Since our light source is on the left, I'm going to go a little heavier on the shades here on the right, taking my time along the hairline and navigating a bit around his brow. I want a bit of this mid shade as the shade along the left too, under the eyes, later under the cheeks. I'm trying to keep very straight lines for the cell shaded effect, and you can see I'm pulling away to look at my references to keep it as close as I can. Some of what I'm painting will also get the darker shadow, which I keep in mind as I go around to go back and either smooth or give more coverage to areas. Some of this will need a couple coats, but I continue to work around the face using my reference. As I continue to work around, I move down to his neck, to the recesses between the muscles here, and then down to his chest. Really trying to create depth between the mid-tone here that we're using and the initial color, which will ultimately end up being our highlight color. As I continue working around, I get a little bit more comfortable, so I decide to move down to the arms. With this, I'll be focusing on the undersides of the muscles, along the recesses again, similar to what we did with the blue, and trying to keep those very clear, very sharp lines for these cell shading, which continues to be weird at this point, especially see it on the skin. I do actually find it easier for the skin than the fabric, so I just continue to work around the muscles and giving them some shape, some definition as we go down the arm. After working a lot of that mid-tone while it's drying, and frankly, because I needed a little bit of a brain break, I pick up some pure white to continue his eyes. With this, I'll be very careful as we do the whites of his eyes, keeping our black as an outline. It will take a couple coats for full coverage, but that's fine. Just go carefully to get the expression and to keep the outline around the edges of his eyes. Then I come back with some black for some of the smaller lines on his face. He has some small marks just under his eye that are a bit of a sketch style that I replicate from the anime. Then we also have some above his brow. While I have black on my brush, you'll notice I also do the first of many hair touch-ups. I'll give him a quick once-over and starting to see how it's coming together. Getting excited. After a quick break and some color matching, I picked Citadel's Death Claw Brown to start the darker shade I mentioned. I load this up on my palette and I go straight to the side of his face that is in the darkest shadow, away from our light source. I follow right along the sculpted edge back to his ear and then up under his chin. After a quick look, I like the shade. I think I've color matched it, so I continue to bring it into his ear and then down onto his neck. Just like the previous color, looking at depth and contrast, shading between the muscles, along where his outfit hits, and then any sculpted recesses. This will also continue to the underside of the muscles, closer to the core of the body. We'll all get this darker shade. And here he is after our first pass at the Death Claw Brown. I do find a few spots that I want to touch up now that I've got more of the colors together, so you'll see me switching between our highlight color and our mid color. Decide to fix his cheek a little bit to get that lighting just right. But moving around now that I've seen all of the colors together and trying to get everything adjusted for the light source between the different shades now that I've seen them together and I see how they're working. Seeing how the cell shading is coming along, I realized we need to get back to his hair. I grabbed Vallejo Dark Gray, which I used to highlight this black all the time. It has a little bit of a blue tone, but it's still pretty neutral. Similar to his suit, his black hair really doesn't get much of a highlight in the series, so we're going to keep it pretty subtle. With his hair, I highlight along the different clumps, picking out different edges along the top, keeping that light source in mind as I move around his head. I follow the sculpt itself, basically highlight the whole edge section that they give me, with a little bit of extra highlighting with the very front. He has quite a bit of hair, so just picking out what I can to give it a bit of depth and separation. And then we'll go back to the skin. With the hair highlighted, I see a few spots of the skin that's bothering me that I really want to tackle before we start any black lining. So you'll see me go back with our mid-tone, our highlights, and just kind of cleaning up some of the areas that, now that the paint's dried and I'm getting another look at it, I just want to fix before we start into the black lining. With my touch-ups done, it's time to start black lining. I decide to start with his eyes, being very careful to get those placed so he's not cross-eyed, and then I will start along the face. Most of this black lining will be along the figure recesses, plus any of the extra lines we want to add to give it that anime or manga flair. So you'll see me work around his face. As I work down to his neck, I realize I almost forgot the best part, his little smirk. So I go back for that, more work on the brows to get his expression as close to possible as I reference, and as true to the sculpt as I can. Similar to the dark shadow, following the natural recess of the figure, and we keep working around. With our first pass of the black lining done, I decided to do a few more touch-ups going back with our shade color, again just trying to even everything out as we go here, any spots that are bothering me before we go on to the next steps. After a small break, I really like how he's coming together, but that blue's still stumping me a little bit just due to the contrast issue we had in the planning phase. Decided to tackle his gloves and his boots first while I mull it over a little bit more. I base coat with Celestra Gray from Games Workshop, and I'm going to let that dry to come back to him a little bit later, so I will get the boots and the gloves. After putting it off, it's time to finally face the blue. I'll be going with Calgar Blue from Games Workshop for our highlight, but first I have some touch-ups to do with our base McCraig Blue. I'll be going around the edges of the outfit to get the sides, the undercuts of the different pieces, to clean things up and get ready for shades and highlights. Then it's time to start our highlights. With our Calgar Blue, I again tackle the bigger, more obvious spots first. Some of these you'll see will change quite a bit as I continue to work in the style, but this is my first pass. I know initially that the chest will get a fair amount of this highlight, along his abs, and then the shoulders, along with our light source. I'll also bring this down to the legs, keeping in mind the cell shading, trying to match the shape of his muscles as I work down. It really is about this part that I kind of have a panic as I'm going. This part is so drastically different than my normal warm hair painting. Here I am fighting every single bit of my brain that wants to blend these colors together. It's killing me a bit to see the hard line between them, so I put them back together to try and get my brain reset, continue to work on these cell shadings, trying to follow the shapes of his muscles. But yeah, this is definitely where it gets a little hard for me. Even with the style being a little uncomfortable, I decided to keep pushing through, try and see if maybe a light bulb goes off, adding more color to keep it nice and bright. About this point, I realized that my reference for the Majin Vegeta is not quite working for his chest, but I don't know what to do instead, so I leave it as is. The flat portion here along his waist also stumps me a little bit. I try to keep my light source in mind and kind of wing it as I go, but trying to clean up the highlights and to keep these nice and smooth as I go. Continuing to work around, I decided to go back up to the shoulders since I know that will be brighter. But just trying to do my best on this first pass, realizing it's not quite working according to reference. After doing a bit more to the chest and shoulders, I decide to go back for that other leg to see what I can get as a first pass. After this though, I decide let's take another break and regroup. After a quick break and coming back, I realize I think it's the lack of shadow that's goofing me up. I grab our dark blue that we've used before and put it back on our palette, and this time I'm going to go back, keeping our cell shading in mind and really give it another attempt. So here I am putting it on our palette. Similar to what we did with the skin, I am going to now use this on the underside of his muscles, in between all the different recesses, and really try and sculpt out his waist as well. I feel like this flat panel here, I'm losing a little bit of the shape, and that is goofing me up, so I decide to dive in and give it another attempt with the cell shading. Seeing how his right side has come together with these shadows, I start to feel a little bit more confident, so I switch over to the left, following this along to sculpt out the waist again and down the side of his leg. He's worked so hard for these muscles, let's make sure we accent them, so trying to get along all of these different curves just so that they pop out. Feeling better with how the legs are coming along, I also switched back to our highlights. So this is the Calgar blue again, going to hit in new areas and also to do a second coat for some of the areas that I've already hit, trying again to get that smooth cell shaded look. While the blue is drying, and my brain's still kind of processing this, I decide to start his gloves. I take London Gray from Vallejo and put it on my palette. This is going to be our shade for the gloves. Similar to the muscles, this will be on the undersides and closer to his body where it is being shaded. So getting that on my palette now, I'm going to leave a very hard cut between the shade and our base layer, the Celestra that we did before, and begin to shade his gloves. His boots are the same color, so I go ahead and bring the shade down to here as well. Similar kind of method applies. The inside here on the sides will get a shadow. With my references, and as he's moving forward, he does have a little bit of a peak in the front of the boots, so you see me actually kind of freehanding the shape out to give it a little more definition. It's kind of similar to what we did with the waist, just providing a little bit more movement, a little bit more definition. Kind of shading this out to give more of a defined shape to the boots rather than just all white. With our shadows started, I want to see the entire look all together. You see me debate paint a little bit there, but I'd settle on Ulthuan Gray from Games Workshop. This is a off-white, just off-white gray that is really nice for highlighting, so I go ahead and put that onto my palette here. I use this over Celestra all the time for Warhammer, so I know that it will work pretty well here. For our highlight, I really want the top portions of this glove, so along his fingers. We'll also do similar to what we did with the shadows and block it out along the wrist and up into the forearm. So working along the fingers here, keeping this nice and bright and as smooth as I can. These whites are a little tougher just to keep all together, so it'll probably take a couple coats, but continue to work along his hand. With the gloves mapped out and highlighted, I move down to the boots. Again, this one I'm trying to make it a little bit from my palette on there. Wipe that off. I'm trying to follow the shape of the boots and as he's striding forward. So when I get back to it here, letting that little oopsie dry, you'll see that I follow the shape along the boots, still trying to kind of sculpt and carve that out since it's not all sculpted on the figure, trying to provide a bit more definition as he's moving forward. At this point, I still have the back of the gloves and the rest of the boots to do, but I want to see how the effect is coming together. So I go ahead and grab our black and start to do our black lining for this first glove that is further along. I'm going to be going along the recesses of the figure, try and get between the fingers. I'm also going to add a few marks towards the end, just to give it that little bit of an anime flair. So just working around the glove and doing the black lining similar to what we did with the skin tones earlier. At this point, since I have black on the palette, I see other places that I want to blackline. I go ahead and move to the other gloves. I get some more on his skin. And then also along the blue. So any of these recesses, kind of the hard edges here, I go ahead and blackline. And then at this point, I kind of feel like I've shown everything for the basics. So I decide to leave it here, and then I actually finish him off stream. And here is where he ends up. And here is the finished figure. So I went ahead and I finished him off video just because it was to the point where I needed to do the back, which is where we're doing all the same things. But here is a quick spin of the shades. I did end up doing the rest of his boots here with the yellow, and you can see where the rest of the shading was. For those boots, I started with golden brown, which is that bottom color you see there. Yellow is kind of that band in the middle. And then I did pull in one more color. This is Dorn yellow for the top of the boot for that final highlight, and the black lining all through there as well. But here is the final figure. I did rework the chest a little bit. That was bothering me, so I brought more of our Calgar blue along the top where the light would be hitting it. I also reworked the middle waist section so that the highlight comes down there through his leg. And with that, our finished figure. For a first attempt, I'm really happy with how it went. There's definitely some things that I would do differently for the next one. I think the biggest thing being the airbrushing. I would keep that to probably just the skin tones. I don't think the masking was worth it. I do it a lot for the Warhammer figures, but for this, so much of it's by hand with the cell shade. I don't think it's worth it unless I'm doing a larger gradient in addition to it. The material is also very different to work with, so I don't know if that would be more matte coats right off the bat. Maybe I try sanding it a little bit more before I get started. It just feels very different. The plastic's very different. So may play with that for the next one. Other than that, I think it's just a matter of doing more and kind of finding my style with it. I really enjoyed it doing the cell shading. Kind of broke my brain in a good way. I think it was fun to approach it in a different way. So excited to do more repaints. Speaking of, I do have one lined up. The next one I've got is Piccolo. So this one was a really cool kind of narrative one. He does have his cape behind him. So I thought this was a really fun one to do. So pick that up for our next one. My lovely Twitch community also picked one up that is Goku and Frieza staring each other down, so I think those will be a lot of fun. If you'd like to see those, make sure you subscribe. I will have those here on YouTube when we get to them. We also stream over on Twitch, so if you'd like to come paint with us live, come hobby with us. My link is down in the description. We're live Sunday through Tuesday right now. Wednesday we're doing YouTube, but that may change in the future, so if you want to come hobby with us, that's down below, along with all my socials. You can check out all my other projects there. Thanks for joining me in my repaint adventure. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.